She wiped flour off her hands, glanced at the clock, and had dinner for 6 ready in 20 minutes. Her secret was never written down. 30 are about to be. The kitchen of the 1950s was not a nostalgic idea yet. It was a workplace, and the woman running it was closer to a factory foreman than a hobbyist. Close to 1 in 3 married women worked outside the home in this decade, which meant the rest, the clear majority, ran the household as a full-time occupation, structured entirely around getting food on the table 3 times a day, every day, for a family that expected it. Here is the part almost nobody expects. These tricks were not secrets passed in whispers between mothers and daughters. Most of them were standardized. They were taught in public school home economics classes and printed by the millions in Good Housekeeping and Better Homes and Gardens. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, and the truth is stranger than folklore. It was a curriculum, and then one day the class simply disappeared from schools. Trick number 1 starts before the cooking even begins. Home economics teachers drilled a simple habit into every student. Lay out every ingredient and every tool on the counter before you strike a match on the stove. No French name for it back then, just common sense, but it meant no mid-recipe scramble for the sifter while the butter burned. That habit saved more minutes than any gadget in the room. A woman who laid everything out before she started could move through a recipe without stopping, without wiping her hands on her apron to dig through a cupboard. It sounds almost too simple to call a trick. But home economics instructors treated it as the foundation everything else was built on, the first rule before any recipe was even read aloud. Trick 2 belongs to the refrigerator. And this one changed everything quietly, in the background, without anyone announcing it. By 1953, close to 9 in 10 American households in cities owned a mechanical refrigerator, up from under half just 13 years earlier. That single appliance rewrote the entire rhythm of the week, and almost nothing that follows in this list would have been possible without it. Before that shift, marketing meant a trip to the butcher and the greengrocer nearly every single day, because nothing kept. Once the refrigerator became common, a homemaker could shop once for the week and plan around it. That single change is the quiet ancestor of nearly every batch cooking trick still praised today. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget where the habit came from. Trick 3 follows directly from the refrigerator. Cook once, eat 3 times. A homemaker would roast a large cut of beef on Sunday, knowing full well it was never meant to be finished in one sitting. Monday, it became hash. Wednesday, it became sandwiches. By the end of the week, it had gone into soup. One long cooking session did the work of 4 separate dinners. It looks like pure frugality on the surface, and it was, but it also depended entirely on that new appliance humming in the corner. Without reliable refrigeration, a leftover roast spoiled before Wednesday arrived, and the whole plan fell apart. The trick that feels the most old-fashioned, the most grandmotherly, was actually made possible by the most modern piece of technology in the house. Trick 4 moves to the freezer, which was becoming a fixture of its own by the middle of the decade. Frozen food sales in America roughly tripled between 1947 and 1953, and home freezers followed the same climbing line. The trick was simple, and it is still repeated by frugal cooks today, without anyone naming its origin. Double the recipe and freeze half. A casserole made on Tuesday could become Thursday's dinner with no extra effort at all, just a trip to the basement freezer and an hour in the oven. This is the direct ancestor of the modern habit of batch cooking on a Sunday afternoon. The idea did not begin with a food blog. It began in a kitchen with a brand new freezer and a woman who understood that her own time was worth protecting. Trick 5 is the pressure cooker, and if you own a modern multi-cooker on your counter right now, you already own its grandchild. Presto and Miro were the 2 names every American kitchen knew, and a pressure cooker could take a tough cut of meat or a pot of dried beans and cut its cooking time by roughly 60 to 70% compared to a simmering pot on the stove. What that meant in practice was dried beans, The cheapest protein in the house could go from a hard little pebble in a sack to soft and ready in under an hour instead of half a day of watching a pot. A tough shoulder cut, the kind a family could actually afford, became tender enough for Sunday dinner in a fraction of the time. It is worth saying plainly, the trendy gadget on your counter has a grandmother, and she lived in a 1950s kitchen. Trick 6 lived in the pantry, not the appliance aisle. Crisco had been on shelves since 1911, and by the 1950s it was the default fat in most baking, not butter, not lard. The reason was pure logistics. Crisco did not need refrigeration, and it kept for a long stretch on the shelf, which mattered enormously to a household that was no longer shopping every single day. It disappeared from store shelves in the form most people remember, and today it carries a different reputation, but at the time it solved a real practical problem. A homemaker could keep a full pantry of baking fat on hand without worrying it would spoil before Saturday's baking day arrived. That kind of shelf stability was not a small convenience. It was the difference between planning a week and living meal to meal. Trick 7 is the one-bowl biscuit, and it has a specific product behind it. Biscuit launched in 1931, but it truly took over kitchens through the 1950s because it eliminated the single most tedious step in biscuit making, cutting cold fat into flour by hand until it looked like coarse crumbs. One box, one bowl, and biscuits were in the oven in minutes. This is where the story gets a little more complicated than the postcard version of the decade. People often picture the 1950s as a purely from-scratch era before convenience food supposedly ruined everything. But the 1950s was itself the birth decade of mass-market convenience, cake mixes, canned soup casseroles, instant potatoes. The one-bowl biscuit was that era's shortcut, not a betrayal of tradition. Trick 8 belongs to the stand mixer, and it was often a wedding gift, which tells you how seriously it was taken. KitchenAid's classic design dated back to 1937, and by the 1950s, owning one signaled a genuinely modern, efficiency-minded kitchen. It meant creaming butter and sugar in 2 minutes instead of 10 with a wooden spoon and a sore arm. The mixer did more than save arm strength. It changed what was realistic to bake on a weeknight. A cake that once required setting aside a full afternoon could go into the oven in 20 minutes flat. For a woman managing 3 meals a day for a family of 5 or 6, that kind of margin was not a luxury. It was breathing room in an otherwise unrelenting schedule. Trick 9 is baking day itself, a practice documented again and again in home economics literature and in the oral histories small-town historical societies have collected from women who lived it. Typically a Saturday, one long session in a hot oven produced bread, a cake, and a pie, all in a single stretch, because heating the oven once for 3 things beat heating it 3 separate times through the week. This is the trick that best explains the whole philosophy of the decade, and it runs against how we think about saving time today. We tend to want something fast every single day. The 1950s homemaker often did the opposite. She front-loaded the labor into one long, intensive session, canning day, baking day, so the rest of the week could move faster. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. Trick 10 is aluminum foil, and its arrival in ordinary kitchens is more recent than most people assume. It had been restricted for military use through the war, and Reynolds Wrap only reached consumers in 1947. Once it did, the foil dinner, sometimes called a hobo pack, became a genuine time and cleanup trick, not just a campfire novelty, and it spread into weeknight ovens fast. Meat, potatoes, and vegetables wrapped together in a single foil packet and set in the oven meant dinner for a whole family cooked in one vessel and left absolutely nothing to scrub afterward. On a weeknight, that mattered as much as the cooking time itself. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and a scrap of foil turned out to be one of the most practical tools in the drawer. Trick 11 takes us to Canning Day, and this deserves care because the equipment of that era was not identical to what is considered safe practice now. The Ball Blue Book, in print continuously since 1909, was the standard reference in most kitchens. A household would can or preserve a large batch in one long session and live off the shelf for weeks afterward. It is worth being honest here rather than romantic. Guidance around canning has been revised more than once since that decade, and older equipment with inconsistent gauges was later found to need updated processing times, particularly for low-acid foods. Canning itself was, and remains, a legitimate skill. But this is history, not an instruction manual, and the specific old methods of that kitchen are not something to copy from a screen today. Trick 12 returns to the freezer with a specific technique, blanching vegetables briefly before freezing them, a step home economics teachers emphasized because it kept color, texture, and flavor intact through months of storage. A quick dip in boiling water, then straight into cold water to stop the cooking, meant a July garden could still taste like July in the middle of January. That single extra step, 30 seconds in boiling water, was the difference between a freezer full of mushy, gray vegetables and one that actually tasted like something worth eating months later. It disappeared from store shelves in the sense that almost nobody thinks about it now when they use a modern freezer, but it still works exactly the same way it did 70 years ago. Trick 13 is the casserole, and it has a documented origin most viewers do not expect. In 1955, a Campbell's Soup Company home economist named Dorcas Riley, working in the company's test kitchen in Camden, New Jersey, was assigned to create a fast recipe using canned green beans and canned cream of mushroom soup. What she invented became one of the most repeated recipes in American history. The genius of the casserole trick was structural. Canned soup did double duty as a built-in sauce, which meant no separate roux, no separate gravy, no extra pot to wash. One dish went from raw ingredients to oven to table, with almost no intermediate steps. It is the reason the casserole became the single most repeated shape of dinner in an entire generation of American kitchens. Trick 14 is smaller, but it shows up in nearly every 1950s recipe card, browning meat and vegetables in the same cast iron skillet used for the rest of the dish, rather than dirtying a second pan. Cast iron held heat evenly and needed no fancy nonstick coating, and reusing one pan through multiple steps of a recipe was simply how a well-run kitchen operated. It sounds obvious now, but it was a deliberate habit, not an accident, and it meant less time at the sink at the end of the night. A single cast iron pan could brown the meat, build the sauce, and sometimes even go straight into the oven to finish the dish, carrying flavor forward through every stage instead of starting over in a clean pot each time. Trick 15 is about the icebox, which is really the pantry's cousin, keeping a running list of leftovers on a small chalkboard or notepad tacked near the refrigerator, so nothing was ever forgotten in the back and left to spoil. It was a primitive kind of inventory system, and it meant a homemaker always knew exactly what needed to be used before it went bad. That small habit prevented waste in a household that could not afford to throw food away casually. Every scrap had a second life planned for it before it even went into the refrigerator. A little wilted spinach became part of tomorrow's soup. A half cup of mashed potatoes became the top of a shepherd's pie 2 nights later. Nothing sat forgotten long enough to spoil. Trick 16 is instant mashed potatoes, which developed through the decade and became a full commercial product by the early 1960s. They were controversial even then among purists, but for a Tuesday night with 3 children hungry at the table, a few minutes with hot water and a fork beat 40 minutes of peeling, boiling, and mashing by hand, and nobody at the table complained. This trick sits right at the fault line of the decade's real character. The 1950s homemaker was not choosing between purity and convenience as some kind of moral test. She was making a practical calculation about a finite number of hours in a day, the same calculation anyone would make. Some nights called for peeling potatoes by hand. Other nights called for a shortcut, and there was no shame attached to either choice. Trick 17 belongs to the electric percolator, which changed morning routine far more than people give it credit for. Set the coffee to perk while getting the children dressed, and by the time everyone was at the table, coffee, toast, and eggs could all be ready within the same short window. 3 tasks running at once instead of one after another. Trick 18 is a simple one about timing the oven itself, baking multiple dishes at once by grouping anything that shared a similar temperature, a casserole and a pan of rolls, sharing the same oven heat rather than running the oven twice in one evening. It required a bit of planning ahead, reading 2 recipes together instead of one at a time, but it cut the total cooking time of a meal noticeably. It is a small trick, almost too small to notice, but multiplied across 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, those small efficiencies added up to real hours reclaimed. This is really the through line of the entire decade's kitchen wisdom. No single trick was dramatic on its own. Stacked together, they were the difference between a woman who was constantly behind and one who, most days, was not. Trick 19 is the recipe card box itself, an index of family favorites written on small cards, organized by category, and kept within arm's reach of the stove. It meant no flipping through a heavy cookbook mid-recipe with buttery hands. The most used dinners lived at the very front of the box, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. There is something quietly moving about that recipe box today, because most of them still exist in attics and drawers across the country, handwriting fading, corners softened by decades of flour and butter. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and a shoebox of index cards is exactly the kind of thing that gets overlooked until someone finally opens it again. Trick 20 is the cake mix, and it had genuine competition by the middle of the decade. Duncan Hines, Betty Crocker, and Pillsbury, all running major cake mix lines at once. The trick within the trick was doctoring the mix, adding an extra egg, a splash of real vanilla, sometimes a spoonful of sour cream, to make a boxed cake taste closer to homemade. This is where Betty Crocker deserves a mention, because she was never a real woman at all. She was a corporate creation from 1921, a friendly, trustworthy voice invented to deliver cooking advice to homemakers by mail and later by radio. By the 1950s, that invented persona had a nationally broadcast program and a cookbook empire, standing in as a kind of mass-produced version of the wisdom every woman was supposed to already know. Trick 21 is the pie crust shortcut, mixing the dough the night before and letting it rest wrapped in wax paper in the cold refrigerator overnight. A rested, chilled dough rolled out far easier the next morning, less sticking, less shrinking in the oven, and it split the workload of a pie across 2 shorter sessions instead of one long, flour-dusted afternoon. It is a trick still whispered among serious bakers today, and it works for exactly the same reason it worked in 1955. Cold fat and rested gluten make for a flakier, more forgiving crust. It disappeared from most casual kitchens as pre-made crusts became available by the end of the decade, but for anyone who wants a genuinely better pie, it still works today just as it did then. Trick 22 is the assembly line method for meatloaf and meatballs, mixing one large batch of seasoned ground meat and shaping it into several loaves or dozens of meatballs at once, freezing most of them raw, ready to bake straight from frozen on a busy night weeks later. One session of chopping onions and measuring seasoning did the prep work for an entire month of dinners. This is the trick that most directly echoes what people now call meal prepping, decades before the phrase existed. The instinct was identical: do the tedious, repetitive part once, at scale, and let future nights be easy. A woman doing this on a Saturday afternoon was not thinking of herself as ahead of her time. She was simply protecting the hours she knew Tuesday would try to take from her. Trick 23 is the gravy trick, saving pan drippings from every roast in a small covered jar in the refrigerator rather than pouring them down the drain, building up a reserve of flavor that could be added to the next gravy, the next soup, the next pot of beans. Nothing with flavor in it was wasted, not even a spoonful of fat. This habit traces directly back to wartime rationing, when sugar, meat, and butter were limited, and nothing could be thrown away without real consequence. Those wartime habits did not vanish the moment rationing ended in the middle of the decade. They simply became permanent kitchen instinct, carried forward by women who had learned out of necessity exactly how far a little fat and a little flavor could stretch. Trick 24 is the bread trick, using slightly stale bread rather than throwing it out, turning it into bread pudding into a savory stuffing, or drying it further in a low oven to make homemade breadcrumbs kept in a jar for weeks. A loaf of bread in a 1950s kitchen rarely had a single simple life. It had two or three. Trick 25 is about the Icebox cookie, a roll of cookie dough kept wrapped in wax paper in the refrigerator, sliced and baked a few at a time whenever the family wanted something sweet. It meant fresh cookies were never more than 15 minutes away without mixing a new batch of batter from scratch every single time company happened to stop by unannounced. It is a small pleasure, but it points at something larger about the philosophy running underneath all 30 of these tricks. Efficiency was never really about eliminating joy from the kitchen. It was about protecting the moments that mattered. A plate of cookies pulled out for unexpected company, a fresh pie on a Sunday, by clearing away everything that did not matter nearly as much and never got a second thought. Trick 26 goes back to the roots of the whole efficiency mindset, and it starts decades earlier than the 1950s kitchen itself. Ellen Swallow Richards, the first woman to attend and graduate from MIT in the late 1800s, argued that running a household was an applied science worth studying seriously, not an instinct women were simply born with, and that belief shaped everything that came after. That idea, household management, as something studied and systematized rather than assumed, is the intellectual root of everything that follows in this video. It is why the 1950s kitchen had rules, curricula, and named techniques at all, rather than just individual habits passed down by accident. It turned cooking from something you absorbed by watching into something you could actually be taught, step by step, in a classroom. Trick 27 is the seasoning shortcut, keeping a small dedicated jar near the stove that blended salt, pepper, and a favorite dried herb together in advance, so a single reach and a single shake seasoned a dish instead of fumbling with 3 separate containers while something browned on the burner behind you and the clock kept ticking toward supper. Trick 28 is the soup pot kept simmering quietly on the back burner through a long afternoon, absorbing whatever vegetable trimmings and bones accumulated from the day's other cooking. Carrot ends, onion skins set aside, a chicken carcass from Sunday. By dinner time, it had become a full pot of stock or soup, built almost entirely from what would otherwise have gone into the trash. Trick 29 is the wall telephone trick, which sounds unrelated to cooking until you picture the kitchen it hung in. Mounted directly in the kitchen with a long cord, it let a homemaker keep stirring, keep basting, keep an eye on the oven while checking in with a neighbor or a sister, folding a social errand directly into the middle of dinner preparation rather than stopping everything to make a call elsewhere in the house. It is a small detail, but it captures something true about how these women actually lived, not isolated, not purely dutiful, but layering connection into the middle of their work rather than treating the two as separate. The postcard version of the decade leaves that out. The real kitchen was noisier, more social, and more resourceful than the sanitized image ever gives it credit for. Trick 30, the last of the 30, is the simplest and maybe the most important, the Sunday planning session, sitting down for 10 minutes with the week's grocery money and mapping out exactly what would be cooked each night before ever stepping into a store. It meant no wasted trips, no impulse purchases, and every single ingredient in the kitchen already had a job to do. That 10-minute habit is, in a lot of ways, the trick that ties every other one together. Laying out ingredients, cooking once for 3 meals, doubling a recipe for the freezer, none of it works without a plan sitting underneath it. The whole week's efficiency was decided before Monday even started, in a quiet 10 minutes at the kitchen table with a pencil and a notepad. Now step back and look at all 30 together because a pattern shows up that is easy to miss trick by trick. Appliances made new habits possible. Wartime scarcity made frugality automatic. And a public school class most people forgot ever existed made all of it teachable, repeatable, and shared across an entire generation of American kitchens rather than locked inside any single family. It is worth pausing on the flowchart of it because the order actually matters. Refrigeration came first and made weekly shopping possible. Weekly shopping made batch cooking possible. And batch cooking is really the root of nearly every single trick on this list, whether it was a roast, a casserole, or a wrapped roll of cookie dough resting in the cold. It is easy looking back from today to assume this all just happened naturally, that efficiency in the kitchen was simply common sense passed down the way it always had been. But it was closer to an engineered system built out of new appliances, wartime necessity, and a genuine academic movement that treated the home as worth studying with the same seriousness as any other trade. And then, within a generation, most of it quietly disappeared. Home economics classes were cut from public schools across the country through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and with them went the formal, shared transmission of exactly these techniques. It was never a secret. It was simply a class that stopped being offered, and a whole body of practical knowledge went with it. That is the honest version of the catchphrase, and it deserves saying plainly rather than mysteriously. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, not because anyone hid it from you, but because the institution that once taught it to nearly every teenage girl in America simply closed its doors and was never replaced with anything quite like it, formal or otherwise. It is worth naming the honest contradiction sitting at the center of this whole story, too, because Nancy, if you have been collecting these details for years, you already sense it. The 1950s kitchen was not a golden age of purity, and it was not a cautionary tale of processed shortcuts either. It was both trends at once, real skill and real convenience, living in the very same drawer. Even the safety story fits that same honest complexity. Canning was and is a legitimate, valuable skill, but the specific pressure gauges and processing times of that decade's equipment were later revised for good reason, tightened for low-acid foods because of real documented risk. Skill and outdated equipment are two different things, and the era holds both without contradiction. It is also worth saying plainly why this all feels so relevant again right now, in the middle of 2026. Grocery budgets are tight for a lot of families, and stretching a week's worth of meals out of a modest cart of ingredients is not nostalgia. It is math. The same math a 1950s homemaker was doing with her own pencil and her own notepad, decades before anyone called it a budgeting hack online. It is not an accident that a stovetop pressure cooker sat in a 1950s kitchen and a nearly identical electric one sits on countless counters today, popularized again in the last decade, as though it were something brand new. It never really left. It just waited quietly in a cupboard for someone to rediscover what a whole generation of home economics students already knew by heart. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and that is really the spirit behind gathering all 30 of these together in one place. Not one dramatic secret, but 30 small, practical decisions made by ordinary women in ordinary kitchens who were simply trying to get a good dinner on the table without losing the whole day to it. None of these tricks were about chasing perfection, and Nancy, that is probably the part worth sitting with the longest. They were about protecting a little bit of ease inside a genuinely demanding life, so there was still time left over for a cup of coffee on the back step or a phone call with a sister once the dishes were finally done and the kitchen had gone quiet. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and every one of these 30 tricks is proof that efficiency and love were never opposites in that decade. They were the same habit, practiced daily, by women who rarely got credit for how much thought actually went into a simple weeknight dinner that nobody at the table ever thought twice about eating. If one of these 30 reminded you of your own mother or grandmother standing at her own counter, I would love to hear which one in the comments below. This channel exists to keep pulling these details out of attics and old recipe boxes before they disappear for good. So if that matters to you too, stay a while, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.